Hey everyone, today we are going to talk about the Enneagram Type Six. We're going to explore their ego map, their money monsters, and their path to money mastery. And all of this content comes from my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram, that releases July 8th, 2025. Pre-orders are available on Amazon. And if you don't know your Enneagram type, you can follow this QR code to the IVQ9 Integrative Enneagram Assessment, which is a great scientifically validated tool for determining your Enneagram type. And if you want coaching from me, you can always reach me at douglynham.com, or if you're looking for a keynote speaker for our next event, I'm doing that too. So would love to see you there. Okay, so let's jump into the basic shadow structure for Type 6. The reason sixes are sixes is because they have a sacred wound of what I call internalized and externalized fear. Now, as you may remember from our previous videos on the shadow structure, I'll recap very quickly. There are 3 core negative emotions in the limbic system of the mammalian brain, and that's going to be anger, sadness, and fear. And all of our negative emotions run off of those 3. Now, when you were a child, you developed an emotional egoic codependence on your caregivers, or what I call your psychological umbilical cord. And that was necessary because you needed that egoic codependence for your caregivers to do the driving of life for you when you were a child. But over time, in infancy, that psychological umbilical cord has to be cut. And it can only be cut with the sharpest negative emotional knives of either anger, sadness, or fear. And if you're a Type 6, you got cut with fear most of all, which you both internalized at yourself, meaning you felt maybe you didn't feel like you had the capacity or resources to defend and protect yourself adequately from some of the biggest threats in your childhood environment. And you also externalized that fear, meaning you didn't feel like the people around you were capable of doing a sufficient job to protect you either. And so you've got this stereophonic fear that becomes forms the chassis of your ego consciousness. And so, which is why I call you the family sedan. We also called the skeptic, often the loyal skeptic, which we'll get into in a moment. But what that means is you're the family sedan of egos because you want every safety feature possible. You're sort of your nervous system is on chronic worst case scenario thinking mode, which is why we call you the skeptic. Like you're just skeptical about you're going to walk into a room and be looking for the where's the emergency exits, where's the fire extinguishers, what could go wrong, what's my escape plan in this situation, and that can be true it's also for your physical surroundings, but also emotionally, in your relationships, in your work. You're just sort of always skeptical and think that something can and probably will go wrong at any minute. So you're always looking to be prepared just in case if something negative does happen. And so all this fear creates all that internalized and externalized fear creates what I call your greatest fear in the Enneagram system, which is being without protection or guidance. Like you don't really trust yourself that much sometimes. You don't really trust others easily. And so what your sixes are looking for is some way to feel safe and protected. And that could be by lots of whatever that looks like for you, but often it means embedding yourself in a family structure, a political, corporate, religious. You want some community around you or some system, some way that you can feel safe in what appears to be a very, very hostile world to you all the time. And so that means that all this creates your greatest vice. And the greatest vice for a Type 6 is going to be cowardice. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be extremely brave in a bar fight. Like you might jump into a bar fight to protect a friend in a heartbeat, but sometimes big independent decisions can be tricky for you because you're just not sure what the right thing is to do. So it's a fear of not knowing what to do because you don't really trust yourself easily and you don't trust others very easily. So that's why we say your greatest vice is really cowardice. And now, just to quick sidebar, as always, I've changed the traditional terminology of the Enneagram significantly in my system, and the traditional Enneagram terms are in parentheses here on this chart, and we're using this new terminology because I think it streamlines things and makes it a little bit easier to understand, especially for newbies, and to get into the mechanics of the Enneagram. All right, so you've got this cowardice, you've got this fear without being protection of guidance, and that comes from your sacred wound of internalized and externalized fear. So this is all in your shadow. This is all unconscious. Your mind doesn't really want to look at this too readily. So you develop a primary ego addiction, which is to fear, right? It's that hyper alert system that's always driving you to be very anxious, like, oh, like what's coming next at you? And so that fear is going to be sort of your daily driver. And it's the thing that, really shapes your response to most things in life, including your response to money. So you're likely to be very anxious around money in different ways. But when all this fear overwhelms you, let me backtrack and say, one of the reasons why you're often called the loyalist is because decision-making is hard for a 6, commitment can be very hard for a 6. So when you do make a decision, when you do commit to a person or to a place or to a particular belief system, you tend to be very, very loyal to it because changing your mind is hard. Let's put it that way. You're going to kind of be like, all right, this. So it's like you've committed so much energy into making the decision that changing your mind can be quite exhausting and can be very hard for you to do. So you're going to be the upside of that is you're very loyal to your friends, you're very loyal to your family, to your company, to your employer, to your employees, and that means you make great, kind, loving friends. But this addiction to fear can get you into trouble, right? Over time, it creates so much anxiety and kind of paranoia that it starts to create the very problems that you're trying to avoid. That's the irony of the Enneagram, that this ego defense mechanism that got you through childhood isn't always great for daily driving in your adulthood and actually makes the thing that you're most scared of become a reality. And so when you overdose on this fear, it can actually push away the systems or the things that are protecting or guiding you. And so you start to be mistrustful of the very things that are providing you the stability that you very desperately want. And so when that happens, then what you do is you fall back to a secondary ego addiction, which for you is vanity, which is the primary ego addiction for a type 3. So you temporarily start to look like a type 3, although you don't become a type 3. But what that vanity does, it sort of puffs up your ego. It gives you a kind of a dopamine hit of self-confidence to overcome that fear. But then it combines with the cowardice of your greatest vice. It's sort of the vanity plus the cowardice creates now what I call your ego stress response, which is self-importance, meaning you become a little too confident in your decision-making abilities. You tend to take charge maybe in somewhat an unhealthy way, or you get really busy with the to-do list. You become almost manically productive of like getting stuff done because everything is so important. You've got to get this done to get this done. But it's trying to maybe reestablish the protection and guidance that you've lost through all this sort of worst case scenario thinking, and maybe being a little it's sort of the opposite. Instead of living in cowardice and fear, you're now living in sort of this self-important vanity, which is can be very it's a maladaptive response, but at the very least it blocks your fear. For at least a little while, you aren't living in so much fear, which is the whole point of this backup ego addiction. So it's relieving the stress on your ego, even though it's doing it in a somewhat maladaptive way, until your nervous system can calm down and you kind of get back to your baseline again and get back on the road driving your family sedan. All right. So now how does this lead into our money monsters? Well, we've got two unhealthy core ways that we can relate to money, and that would be to be overly avoidant around money, meaning just like in our romantic relationships, we can be anxiously attached to our romantic partners or avoidant of them, and we can have the same kind of unhealthy dynamic around money. So a 6 who is money avoidant is going to let their fear of money push money away unconsciously, living in a sort of a scarcity mindset, or just they're so afraid of the world of finance that they never become financially literate. They're not going to, and not really focus on mastering all 4 pillars of finance. And the 4 pillars of finance are earning, saving, investing, and giving. So you need to master all 4 of those to have a really robust and secure financial life. And a money avoidant 4 is probably going to push one or more of those things away. They might be too loyal to their employer that they don't level up their career and make the kind of money they really should. They might be avoidant around, say, saving money. So they might make a decent income, but they're not really focused on saving because they're too busy trying to maybe buy some secure, what they feel like emotional soothing through impulse shopping, shall we say. Or they could be so avoidant that they are scared of the world of investing, that they don't want to risk their money in the stock market. They don't trust it. So they never really invest adequately to allow compound growth to work in their favor so they can really build up a significant amount of wealth. Or they might be avoidant around giving and not really giving back to their community once they have some resources. So you can be anxious and avoidant in different areas of the 4 pillars of finance. So you might be inconsistent or jumbled style, kind of what I call your Frankenstein's financial monster, where you're anxious in one area and avoidant in another. But if you're so that's the avoidant type, but I call them the paralyzed. So the paralyzed is like the deer caught in the headlights. They're so overwhelmed with fear. They're so overwhelmed. They're letting their fear and cowardice overtake them to the point where they're sort of paralyzed by inaction. They don't really get the job done that's necessary to have that strong financial future and life. Now, if they're anxious around money, which could also be common in 6s, then they have this sort of dual nature. I call them the puppet and the pugilist. So a 6 who's anxious around money is hyper focused on it. They're really concerned about it, maybe a little too much in some ways. But what that means when they're the puppet, it means because they're living in fear and in uncertainty all the time, the puppet is a 6 who's going to just sort of follow all the rules. They're going to follow all the rules of convention, which can be a very good thing. It can lead to a solid financial life, even if one that's a little bit uninspired. But then they can become the pugilist when things go wrong, when things don't go according to their plan, or their worst case scenario thinking plays out and something bad happens, which it always does in life. Then they can sort of flip into what I call a pugilist mode, which is pugilist is an old-fashioned term for a boxer or a fighter. So they start to lash out in anger at the people around them. Like they might lash out at their partner who overspends their budget this month, or they might lash out at a boss or a colleague who's makes a decision at work that they don't agree with that somehow has a negative financial impact. So these things can be quite damaging over time, and they're just a little too hyper focused on things. They don't have they're sort of driving with road rage, if you will. In their financial life. So a healthy 6 finds a little more balance between they're not stuck in paralyzed fear, but they're also not sort of hyper vigilant out of fear either. So those are the two kind of extremes that they can sort of bounce between, and they can derail their financial life. Now, over time, what happens as we move through this double-coned Enneagram, which we've talked about extensively in other videos, you've been moving in childhood from unconscious unity in the womb up to conscious separation in adulthood. Your ego needs to grow through this shadow structure, which is necessary and good. It's establishing your independence in life. We call it the first half of your life, where you're moving from thee to me, or thee being whatever your name for the sacred and the divine happens. Whatever sound you want to make with your ape face to describe the holy or God, use that. But whatever it is that brings you from that holy origin into your individuated consciousness, that's what's happening. The Enneagram is describing that path of maturation in your youth. But then your ego keeps growing to the point where it doesn't know when to stop. and it keeps growing until it hits the boundaries of reality to the point where it's pushing everyone and everything else away, including your sense of the sacred. Like your ego gets puffed up like a blowfish, and now you feel trapped inside your own consciousness, separate from the people that you love, separated even from your sense of the sacred and the divine, and you're really in this dark night of the soul. And this often comes through your classic midlife crisis. It can happen through an external tragedy, can hit you, and then you overdose on your ego addictions, and that tosses you into the dark night of the soul, which can happen multiple times in your life, by the way. It's not a one and done necessarily. But every time we fall into that dark night of the soul, if we have a spiritual practice, then our goal is to let that pain and suffering soften our ego, let it crack us wide open and allow us to sort of release some of these ego addictions, which ironically are the source of most of the self-created suffering in your life. So there's going to be external tragedies that are going to hit you, of course, but most of the suffering in your life you're going to find is going to come through these ego addictions and your greatest vice. For all of us, it's just how it works. And so we need to kind of move through that and move into our enlightenment structure. So as we move out of the dark night of the soul, we're now moving into your path of interdependence, or what I say from me to we, and getting up to that point of conscious unity, which is sort of the goal of all of our spiritual traditions and paths, is we can live in a conscious unity in love and service to a suffering world. But it's going to take a unique flavor for each of the 9 Enneagram types. Think of it like this: when you let the love of the divine fill you, it fills us all up. It pours into all of us without any discernment. But the thing is that we tend to notice where it fills us up in the places where we are most empty. So although what's pouring into each of us, that love of God, that compassion, that mercy of the divine is universal, I should say, we notice it in the places where we most are lacking. And so it takes on that flavor for each of our Enneagram types in a different way for each type. Okay, but how do we get there? Well, the first thing we have to do if you're a 6 is avoid your faux virtue of modesty. So your faux virtue is your fake virtue. It's a good virtue for other types, but for you, it's kind of a spiritual trapdoor. It's that modesty can trap you in that fear or cowardice and not let you step into your true power and your true strength, and leave you indecisively paralyzed, or it can leave you, lashing out at other people as a pugilist, or trapped in kind of puppet mode, trapped in your money monsters. It's like not having the courage to assess yourself adequately. That modesty can for you, when used inappropriately, reinforce your cowardice and your worst case catastrophic thinking. You're saying, well, I'm not being fearful, I'm just being prudent. I'm not being scared, I'm just being realistic. Like that's a kind of modesty that's maybe not exactly accurate. You need to have a little more, what we can now move into your primary recovery virtue, which would be faith. Now, you need to have more faith in yourself, and you need to have more faith in the benevolence of the universe around you. Now, this faith is not about any doctrine or any dogma or a particular set of beliefs. It's that trusting in yourself. It's like that faith is what's going to help you overcome that cowardice, that greatest vice, and that fear, which is your primary ego addiction, and having the faith that ultimately the universe is made in love, and the universe loves you and wants the best for you, in whatever symbolism that happens to resonate in your particular spiritual tradition, and being able to step out in faith, in courage, into that love more fully. Right. Now, your secondary recovery virtue, which opens up for you when you can practice that faith, is going to be assertiveness. Right? So assertiveness is the primary recovery virtue for type 9, which means you sort of look a little bit more like a healthy type 9 when you're practicing assertiveness. It means that assertiveness is going to help you overcome that fear, overcome that cowardice, stand up for yourself and your needs a little bit more fully, make more decisive decisions without having to overthink and catastrophize, and worst case scenario, think every little thing that leaves you constantly on edge. And then when you can bring together those two, the primary recovery virtue of faith with your secondary recovery virtue of assertiveness, that leads to your greatest virtue or your highest virtue for you, which is going to be courage. So like with every Enneagram type, our greatest weakness, when we heal it, becomes our greatest strength. So all that cowardice and fear that's been gnawing at the inner part of your soul now gets alchemized in a sort of spiritual alchemy into courage, and you become the bravest and most courageous of all Enneagram types. And when you can live in that greatest virtue of courage, doesn't mean you aren't scared, right? Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of being afraid and being able to step into your true strength and power. And then when that happens, you fulfill your greatest hope, which is to know complete protection and guidance, meaning you found this inner connection inside yourself as a fractal piece of the divine, to know that your soul has always been and always will be protected and guided through the sacred and through the divine, but also you have more faith and trust in yourself, in your own ability to stand up for yourself. And you're not so much looking for that protection and guidance externally, but you found it internally. And even though tragedy is still going to hit you, bad things are still going to happen to you, you found this core inside yourself that's a little bit more steady. And then that's when you will know complete protection and guidance, when you aren't looking for it outside yourself, but finding it inside yourself. And that reveals your sacred gift. Now, this is your cosmic community service to bring to the world, which is divine trust, or you could say divine faith. It's that you have that trust in the universe, and you live in this courageous trust as you go out there and make your most beautiful and loving mark in the world. You become a great leader. You become the person we all can be inspired by. And you teach other people how to trust, because you, most of all, had the hardest time trusting. So when you learn to do it, like, you're the one who can show the rest of us how to do it most effectively. And you bring that divine trust into the world. So that brings you to your money master, which is the pioneer. You become kind of the Lewis and Clark of personal finance. You start to overcome your money avoidance and your money anxiety, and you really spend the time and put the effort into mastering those 4 pillars of finance: earning, saving, investing, and giving. And you do them with courage and with faith and with assertiveness, and you're living you have that courage to really master those 4 pillars of finance. And then you become this pioneer who really has their financial life together and can show the rest of us how to do it as well. All right, and that's the basic ego map for the Type 6. And if you want much more depth and more practical steps, how to put all this into action, please check out my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram, or go to my website, DougLyam.com, for more if you want to interested in speaking opportunities for me, or you want individual coaching. All right, gang, we'll talk to you next time. Take care.